Right now I have before me three good 13th century experts. That's great, great. So I'll
Good
wait
evening,
a
gentlemen.
minute or so more before we start, just in case somebody else wants to join in. But
We're all sitting in front of a bookcase, huh?
what is
One of the things that I get a lot, talking to a number of people about, at the moment I'm writing this thing about Grandson, is how on earth the story of Otto de Granson's never been made into a movie. I mean, you pitch this story about this lifelong relationship between him and Edward, and they go off with the Welsh Wars, the Bridge of Boats, the Fall of Acre. I mean, goodness gracious, there are an awful lot more, shall we say, lesser subjects chosen. If we have another one about the Tudors, for goodness sake, and we have that many remakes of Robin Hood, goodness gracious.
He didn't get married. That's the problem, isn't it? Perhaps they could float him as a gay icon, you see, and that might get him some more.
There are always these, yeah, and there's everyone keeps asking me, yeah, are you going to talk about the rumors of his relationship with Leonor?
Wasn't he meant to marry the daughter of the Count of Burgundy?
There was a few that Edward tried. I think in the end, when you look at his life, I mean, how many horse miles that guy put in? I mean, if they'd have been having air miles, it was like Henry Kissinger died today, with the amount of traveling that Kissinger did, the amount of traveling that Grandson did. Yeah. My goodness me, he would have walked with bow legs by the time he was 30.
Hugh, do I understand your charters of Peter Savoy are coming out soon?
Well, as I understand it, next week actually, and the volume is due to be published next week. It's going to be presented to John Maddicourt next Monday, and so I take it then it'll be published more or less straight away. Michael, you know about the details of the publication? I know no more about it than that, really.
It's really the annual volume of the Pipe Roll Society, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I suspect people will get it for Christmas or something.
Right. I think what wasn't the last volume Louise's on Eleanor's household roll?
I think there may be.
Oh, yes.
I think there may be one since then.
Okay.
Might be.
Wasn't it Eric Gallagher's and Leslie Boatwright's Pipe Roll?
Anyway, Louise's was very interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, it was incredible. I probably, of all the books I reviewed, that's the one I gave 5+ stars.
Yeah. It's just fascinating insight into what it was like being in a castle in that period, you know, and how they're getting it ready, and all the different sort of I remember the bit about, you know, whether you allowed the garrison out into the town to have a bit of a drink and release from being inside the walls or not. I think that was fascinating, and about the lights. I think there was something about whether they were allowed to have lights on the walls as well, and things like that. I thought that was the best thing about it, actually. Yes,
I like the bit she did about the messengers and who they were going to, you know, showing who was in contact.
Yes.
But it was so interesting that she shows that they're receiving shoes like every few months. I mean, like, I imagine the quality must have been, you know, good enough, but they must have been doing a lot of, you know, footwork from this point to that point for them to wear out so many shoes.
Of course, Eleanor was the king's sister, and she always, you know, she never let anybody forget it, really, did she? You know, she was royalty, and I think you have to sort of think about the Montforts as if they were sort of Hello magazine sort of mega stars of that sort of jet setting royalty. Otherwise, you just can't understand them, really. They were just like that.
It's the family interest. I mean, that's one thing that really struck me throughout of this, is that what was Peter's role? Peter's role in England should have been Guillaume's role. You know, Guillaume was going to be this guy there that was going to be effectively the right-hand man or Eleanor's protector. And of course, he gets murdered, so they have to get the next taxi off the rank. And the next taxi off the rank is Peter. He's not doing anything very much here. So off he goes to England, and yeah, he does very well for himself. But his main role, I mean, we know this from the this controversy that's going on now, of course, with the princes in the Tower again, is that it's dangerous being a medieval queen. And so, from the family perspective, it's good to have an uncle there to make sure that the interests are being protected.
If I remember, didn't Peter leave his orders around 1234 after his father died, I think?
Yeah, he was looking for something to do, and we found that he'd met up with people from England earlier than he went to England, because you had this army going into Italy with some English knights. He met John Monsell before even he'd been to England. So yeah, he was aware of the situation, but I think he was looking to take lands around this region to take from the Count of Geneva. He was very much
I mean he was a younger son, so
yeah, he was
when
descended from the Count of Geneva too. You remember there had been this usurpation in the County of Geneva, and that seemed to be his focus at that point, was basically trying to sort that problem out.
This opportunity to go to England arose, and he goes there, and Henry quickly sees that he is the kind of international diplomat he's looking for. So, but
it's Guillaume, Guillaume too, isn't it?
But is it a fair enough question to wonder, how many hands might have been involved in the demise of William of Savoy? Because it opened the way for a lot of people.
It did. There's a fantastic paper that was written by a guy in Belgium about Guillaume, the many tentacled monster. He kind of had upset one or two people, shall we say, had he not?
Yeah.
And of course, as we go into this thing about the honor of Richmond, he held the honor of Richmond before Peter. So it was unusual that Peter. Everyone says, it was kind of unusual that Peter gets the honor of Richmond before he even gets to England.
He was knighted by Henry, so
there
you have a sort of let's say a 6-year period of him more or less, showing off his military ability. And is he more or less waiting to be knighted by somebody of Henry's stature, or?
Very likely. I mean, it's interesting. Eleanor's dad, of course, was knighted by the emperor, but it's looking for a sponsor. And of course, the whole of this story doesn't get to happen without Blanche de Castile, because the Savoyards get to the court in England because the court in Paris has been blocked, because Blanche doesn't want little Louis having all of the in-laws around. Thank you very much. So we could even
she's got her massive iron fist ready to swallow up Provence.
Because Guillaume goes up to Paris, and he wants the entry into the court in Paris that eventually gets into London. So Paris was the first choice, but they don't get it. Then it's England. And of course, you've got the thing with Thomas as well, the brother that ends up as the Count of Flanders. In fact, that's the bit that really struck me, is that she nearly marries Simon de Montfort. Imagine how history would have been different if the Countess of Flanders had married Simon de Montfort.
Now there you go. I mean, and I sort of posit that, sort of my own speculation, you might say, that it was Henry who more or less suggested to Simon, go over, court those older ladies. You're not going to be successful because Blanche is not going to allow it. But you're going to be sending a message to her that I'm not giving up, the pressure's going to be on. And if you come back and nothing turns out, well, you can have Eleanor. I more or less feel that Eleanor and Simon had been in the works long before it happened.
I mean, I think the evidence seems to suggest that Simon de Montfort seduced the king's sister, didn't he? Because they had to have this shotgun secret wedding, and which produced that huge political furore. I mean, you could imagine Eleanor having anything less than a kind of state wedding or anything, could you? So I there's something terribly underhand about it.
Well, I don't think he more or less seduced her. I think that was Henry's excuse. That, of course, I think Henry, of course, knew it. You know, they all knew it. They all knew what was going on. But you know, when Henry needed an excuse to more or less oust Simon, well, that came in handy.
Guillaume de Savoy was involved in that too. There is one of the allegations of sort of in terms of stepping on toes is that Guillaume had misadvised at this point that he was new to England and hadn't realized that you know, having one of the nobility rising to royal rank, so to speak, by marrying Eleanor would upset all the other nobles and upset Richard. So yeah, there's even the Savoy element there, that Guillaume perhaps was being less than the best advice.
Yeah, well, gentlemen, we could be talking about this all night. I would love to, actually, but we only have so much time and we got to get around. So John, could you first tell us a little bit about where you come from, where you ended up, and how you got into writing a biography of Peter Savoy?
Yeah, I was going to say, this is my partner over here. She's saying it's all my fault. I spent most of my life as working in corporate travel and got bored with that, and had a midlife change and ended up doing a master's in history up in Newcastle. I met my partner here in Switzerland and ended up coming to Switzerland. And by chance, after about 2 or 3 days, we were visiting the castle at Yverdon, and I saw on a little panel there, very hidden away, that this castle had been built by Master James of St. George. And something in my brain remembered that he'd been responsible for all those castles in North Wales. And so you start to follow a trail back. I found all of the other builders and so forth that have been involved. Michael's work was very interesting in that regard. And then I realized, of course, that none of this happens without Grandson. And then you realize that Grandson doesn't happen without Peter of Savoy. Peter of Savoy doesn't happen without Eleanor, and you sort of follow a trail back. And I kind of realized it started off as an interest in these castles in North Wales, but the whole thing just kind of mushroomed. And I kind of almost joked with people here in the Swiss Romand that was anybody left here at all in the 13th century, they all gone to England, because it was almost that there were people coming out. There were clerics, there were knights, there were all sorts of people coming from all different directions. And, you know, right, as Hugh has documented, and the subject just got very big.
And I, you know, in your book, you even give us names of some of the soldiers that Peter had mustered up in Flanders for the invasion that never took place, because up until now, this has always been a nameless army. Now we can put names.
One of the advantages, one of the best advantages, so I intend to be moving back to England at some point in a few years' time, but one of the advantages of living here was actually be able to go and visit these places and actually track these things down, and you start to get a feel for the lay of the land and the relationships between them. So that, for example, that Flanders army that you mentioned there, you start to realize that they're all, it's not just a Savoyard army, they're all Peter's personal followers from before he became count, and a lot of them are associated with his wife. So yeah, there's a lot of Forcigny in there.
And as you also say, you know, there is that connection between the force that ended up landing in Wales in 1265 that formed the core of, basically the core of the army Edward eventually assembled, and this also came around between Peter and Eleanor abroad, right?
Yeah, I mean, I first got into that whole thing really from Margaret Howell's book, but then when you start to join the dots, and then you, especially this summer, you look at the relationship of the Joinville family to Peter, and it starts to become much more important. You start to realize that Simon de Joinville, I think Hugh and I have been talking for a while about that. Simon de Joinville appears to play a much bigger role in Peter's life than people have thought of before. It's almost that he was effectively a fix-it. You have in the time earlier in Peter's time in England that Pierre de Grandson and Chamvon are effectively his representatives in this region while he's in England. He's a great delegator. That Joinville seems to play that role later in the time.
He was a brother of the biographer of Louis. Was he a brother?
There were three brothers. So you have, well, there are more than three brothers, but the three that we're interested in, there was Jean, who is the biographer of Louis. obviously at the French court, and he's the seigneur in Champagne. But two of the other brothers, Geoffrey goes to England, and Simon and he gets this big job eventually in Ireland, and gets this wonderful marriage again to one of the Marcher ladies, Breaults. But you've also then got this younger brother Simon, who is the Seigneur de Gex here near Geneva, but he spends a lot of time also in England. But he's also very influential in organizing these nights and getting effectively a gopher, so to speak, for Peter for things that he wants organizing here whilst he's in England.
But I think it's a shame that Geoffrey did not undertake a biography of Henry, you know, in similar scope to what his brother did for Louis, because our whole idea of Henry would be so different today, you know, not just Matthew Paris's nasty diatribes and so forth. Well, gentlemen, you know, this is supposed to be a launch, and I've got the champagne here, and it's starting to sweat. So I'm going to pop it open here. And if you have something on hand, I will just take that about there. And so I've got your book, yeah, more or less. So this is it, you know. You know, the cover looks great. Peter Savoy, the little Charlemagne, and you know, and it asks all the important questions at the end on the back. You know, this statue or this stylized thing of Peter on the Savoy Hotel. And the one I find interesting is, why do we find elements of the Magna Carta in the statutes of Savoy? And so anyway, this is the moment of the christening. So I hereby christen thee, you know, Peter Savoy, the little Charlemagne, and fare thee well in all your journeys through the bookstores of the world, you know. And I hope that this adds to our understanding and appreciation of 13th century history, because I'm still of the opinion that it was the greatest of the medieval period. So anyway, cheers to you, and all the best for your success.
As they say here, Sante.
All right, great. So
that cover is that cover is
yeah.
interesting, actually, Darren, because you know that this is this drawing that this antiquarian Kerrich makes visiting Savoy in the 18th century. This tomb has now been completely destroyed, and Kerrich attributes this tomb to Peter of Savoy, which is interesting because the sources tell us Peter of Savoy is buried in Hautecombe Abbey. Whether there were two tombs, whether there was just some sort of memorial in that Kerrich found, we will never know, because unfortunately the church that Kerrich saw this tomb of Aigues Blanche and of Peter of Savoy no longer exists. It's been completely torched by the revolutionaries, and Hautecombe Abbey the same. So all of the possible places, but that drawing that he made is interesting, because that drawing may be some sort of likeness of Peter, maybe. Whether it is or not is the publisher Pen and Sword asked for a colorization, so we've done our best in terms of, you know, the imperial shield. May or may not be, but the bit that was interesting about that, if you read Kerrich, is that he asked who this tomb was, and the guy basically said, "Oh, it's the Englishman." And you get this is really quite strong, because in England he's always seen as the foreigner.
Let me ask you something. So we have this more or less network of Savoyards in England. They have drawn the ire and fury of Matthew Paris and all the Dunstable analysts, and you know, all these foreigners everywhere. But was there more or less a centralized command of them? Because you also have the Bishop of Hereford, and you have all these you know, religious, you know, people from the family. You have the wives who came to England. So can we more or less say that Eleanor is kind of the head of this clan, if you will, in England, or is Peter still calling the shots?
It's a very good question. Certainly, the whole reason whether she's the head in practical terms or whether she's the head in titular terms, she's certainly the head of the triangle.
Right.
So Eleanor is it.
Yeah,
The whole
because
reason they're there is Eleanor.
right. I mean, I'm of the opinion now that it was Eleanor who put together this little cabal against the Lusignans, and that Eleanor was more or less, you know,
It's
pulling
one
the
thing,
strings
Darren, one thing
behind
you'll
this.
never get an answer to. One thing you'll never get an
Oh,
answer to, I think, is how
yeah.
much was Peter and how much was Eleanor.
Well,
So
you know, but
the-
there are little tidbits there. I mean, the most obvious one is where Richard de Clare stood, you know, and also why Henry and John Manzel and all the others were so eager to go forward. So I more or less feel that Henry saw, well, I can sacrifice my half brothers if I get my funding for Sicily. I mean, they can always come back. So,
she's the
but
head.
of
She's
course,
she's
you
the
know,
head.
things got out of hand after that. So,
Yeah,
Because
well,
everything flows from that. All of their position. Sorry, Hugh. All of their position in Europe flows from Eleanor's position at court in London.
right.
So
yeah,
that's the
well,
impact.
all I was going to say was, you know, there are a number of narrative sources, as you know, which say that the Lusignans were brought down because they offended Queen Eleanor. And in fact, there is a letter which Henry, well, at least under the control of the council, wrote to the Pope, I think, which said more or less the same thing, didn't it? And that the Lusignans offended the Queen repeatedly and more or less seduced the Lord Edward into rebellion, or so I you know, how do I put it? There was that narrative there, certainly.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
we
I think things were a little bit more complicated than just simply the court dispute, but certainly that made it possible to bring the Lusignans down. Yes,
I mean, we have so many instances where Henry seems to be against his half brothers, and you know, they say, well, you know, Eleanor's telling him what to do. I can't buy that. I mean, his letter to Richard of Cornwall telling him, guard the coast, you know, my brothers might be trying to come in with an armed force, because by that time they were allied with Simon de Montfort, you know. So I think Henry was very much,
yeah, but Darren, you've got to be a bit careful. I mean, in that period, you know, letters are written in the king's name. I do think you have to be, you know, with Henry, you have to know who is around the king, who's promoting these letters. I think you sort of attribute too much to Henry's own will in all this. Henry is just highly influenced by whoever happens to be dominant in his entourage at any given time. And I think that you can't understand Henry III otherwise.
well, okay, that's a very good point here, because would you say the same thing about Edward or John?
No.
Okay, so
I
this
think
comes
they are
back
much
to
more
more or less the
independent-minded.
personality question, right?
Yeah, they're much more kings who are in control. I think Henry is a king who is easily influenced.
All right, so I mean this I've seen this narrative in Stacy and Carpenter, and so now the point becomes, is this because he was a boy king and he never grew up, and so for 56
Well,
years more or
you
less
could look at it
dominated?
you could look at it from a psychological point of view. Yes. I
Okay,
mean, again, going back to Peter of Savoy, you see, Peter of Savoy, no doubt appealed to Henry III since he was about the same age as he was, as indeed I think Simon de Montfort was, and these were sort of companion figures that no doubt the king enjoyed having in his company, and in many ways, of course, I think Simon de Montfort was a natural potential rival to Peter of Savoy, you know, these are court favorites, and you know, they in many ways they're no more and no less than that, really.
But how do you explain somebody like John Manzel, who was younger than Henry, who was Henry's protege?
Well, he's got other sort of uses, hasn't he? You know, he's a sort of king's
Yeah.
sort
I mean,
of
that
another sort of
relationship.
advisor, isn't he? Who rose up through the ranks of the, if you like, English civil service, didn't he? He's more a sort of civil servant kind of character.
No, John Manziel, come on. He was high. He had to have been highly respected. I mean, he's journeying
he
with
is,
Richard
but-
de Clare.
But John Mansell is not aristocracy, is he? He's not, you know.
Right, and this is the new beginning under Henry, where the humble man rises to the council.
You're dealing in a period when aristocrats were aristocrats. You know, Peter of Savoy, Sam de Montfort, William de Worms, they were aristocrats.
They're aristocrats,
You
but
know how
I'm
to
saying
pass
that
the
Henry
torch,
maybe
you know,
was
I mean,
the new man. He doesn't trust these aristocrats.
you Americans don't understand these things. You know,
These aristocrats have risen in rebellion against his father, against him. He's out to do away with them.
Just to bring us back to Peter of Savoy, just for a moment with that, though, that this relationship with Peter of Savoy and Simon de Montfort is fascinating, because you have these two guys who begin as the oath takers. They're taking this oath together, and then it ends up almost figuratively, I kind of say in the book, that they're sitting on either sides of the English Channel as sworn enemies at the head of armies, and that's quite a journey to get from point A to point B. And
yeah.
I think fundamentally the heart of that is a lot of things, but the heart of that is the Lord Edward. Is when Edward starts to gravitate towards the Lusignan clan, the fear of Eleanor and the fear of the Savoyard is that, yeah, they're going to lose the prized asset. The prized asset. I almost say that if there was I don't know, Darren, you know that in England we have these things called a stick of rock at the beach, where you have this candy with then often it has the name written inside. That Edward would almost have Fabriqué en Savoie written, cut right through the middle, because he's their project, he's their pet, so to speak. So for him to be going off into the Lusignan area, it's a direct threat.
Well, I mean, Hugh made this argument that 1258 is about the future. It's about Edward. Everything from 1258 onward, Edward is the center of the play.
I suppose so,
yeah.
I suppose one of the most intriguing questions that has never been explained is why the Simon de Montfort never managed to get his sons into Edward's entourage. Right. It came pretty near to it during that period at the end of 1260, when Montfort is dominant at court, his first sort of blast, if you like, of dominating the council. And then Edward knights Montfort's sons, and they go off together tournamenting. And that's really what Montfort wanted.
Yeah.
But it never really worked out. And it's mostly, you know, it's really, you know, something that is so difficult to understand, because these were, of course, Edward's cousins, and they were exactly from the right sort of background and so on. Who knows why this didn't work for Montfort? But it was that sense of insecurity that Montfort had, that he didn't have his sons in Edward's entourage, that helped to explain why he was willing to throw his lot in with the baronial reform movement in 1258. Well, at least that's one of the explanations, anyway, that I would suggest. And it was one of the driving factors in Montfort's career.
Right. So you're more or less comparing why they joined his entourage late in the game, more or less. Yeah. I mean, I think this is Simon. I mean, Simon has basically drawn Edward away.
A big problem Peter had, of course, was he didn't have any sons, and that was something which sort of haunted him, really, in so many ways.
Yeah, it's almost, I mean, going back to that will thing that we were talking about, that Amadei and Louis almost become the sons. These are the sons of Tom.
Potentially, yes.
One thing that we found, there is a thing here, going back to the Alpine bit, that Peter usurps the county of Savoy from these two sons because they're really closer in line. You do get the feeling that this has been a family meeting, that Philippe and Pierre have sat down and they've agreed, I'll have the county, then you have the county, and then we'll effectively almost be regents, and we'll hand over to Amadei. Now, there was a talk at the time that this was a usurpation, or in terms of contemporary French historiography. But when you look at it, the results were successful. The results were that the county hung together. The results were that Amadei, the boy, becomes Amadei the Great.
Can I ask John a question?
Yeah, sure.
You know, you just mentioned that Peter didn't have any children. Have you ever looked into the business whether Stephen of Penchester was his illegitimate son?
No, he had children. He had this daughter Beatrice, and that's what causes all of this problem with the Faucigny. And in fact, actually, that I'll just mention this very briefly because that is what ends the Savoyard relationship with England in the end. Because what that does is that marries, which seems a good idea at the time, that marries the Faucigny and Dauphiné together. So effectively gets rid of an enemy through the marriage. But what it then does is when the Dauphiné becomes part of France, the French then say, well, we really ought to have the Faucigny because we have this relationship going back to Beatrice. And during the 100 Years' War, one of the agreements that is made effectively is that you okay there? I think it's okay. I think it's okay. One of the agreements, sorry, Michael, one of the agreements which is made is that Savoy will pull out of this relationship with England and effectively become neutral in the 100 Years' War, and then the French will give up their their claim to Faucigny. So this daughter Beatrice does actually effectively in the end, because of her marriage, it ends the relationship with England. But going back to your question, in terms of this illegitimate relationship, no, and it would be interesting to take a look at that a lot more.
Well, he has the same arms, doesn't he? And I think it's Anthony Wagner that first makes, as far as I know, the point that they are related. And he had at Allington Castle in Kent, which oh God, the bloke who used to run the polling organisation lives in now. Forgot what his name is. The big wheel in the Magna Carta thing. But, and I think there's a Stephen Penchester, whose arms are on display in Winchelsea Church. So, you know, this is all Sussex stuff, you see, because I live in Sussex.
Yes, I get to know Sussex better than I used to, shall we say.
Yeah, John, can I ask, where are you from in the UK?
I'm from Lancaster.
That's that northern part, right?
That's right up, but yeah, that's with this enormous Norman castle that somebody plonked on us back about 1,000 years ago. And
Michael, you come from around Liverpool, right?
Well, I was born in Chester. And
okay, close enough. And Hugh, you are from where originally?
Me, I'm from South Wales.
South Wales. All right. So we have a nice Western mix here, right?
except that my grandfather came from Canton Vaud. He would have been, his village was in the lordship of Grandson. So, you know.
You were Vaudois.
An economic migrant.
Yes. Your family is Welsh?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yes, and Welsh speaking as well. Right. And because they were originally from where I'm from is actually from near Cardiff, which is very east South Wales. But my grandparents, they all came from the west, which is much more Welsh speaking.
Right. Okay. Did you speak Welsh at home?
Yes, we did. Yes. My grandmother lived with us, and she was from Carmarthenshire, and she was thorough Welsh speaking. But she died when I think I was about 10. Well, in those days, anyway, we're talking about the 1960s, late 1960s. You know, if you wanted to get on, Welsh was not yet the fashionable language that it is now. And so I mean, for example, when I was in the school, I was told that if I wanted to get to Oxford, I had to do German rather than Welsh. And so you know, they wouldn't say that nowadays, but
You
So that's what I
probably
did, really. I didn't do any exams in Welsh or anything like that. So
you probably know that the relationship with Welsh and English, of course, is not a good one. But here they have their own language. That the people of the 13th century wouldn't have been speaking classical French here. They would, as the Parisian French, they would have been speaking a language which gets us into the question of what language did Peter speak. I'll come to that in a moment. But the language is now called Arpitan. Used to be called Franco-Provençal, and they preferred to rename it Arpitan from Franco-Provençal because it's neither Provençal nor French. It's actually a mongrel of the two. So this language was effectively obliterated by standard French. So at least Welsh survived you. The local language here, the language that people like Otto Granson, possibly Peter of Savoy, were speaking, no longer exists. There are societies that try to renovate it, get it going again. But the problem, of course, is that most of its speakers were in France. And of course, France is not very tolerant of other languages, shall we say.
No. They've been much more tolerant of Breton, haven't they? For quite a while now, since de Gaulle's time, I think. But you know, that's always been a big issue. But I mean, come back to Peter. I mean, you know, he was one of these international aristocrats. He spoke whatever the language was, wasn't it? I mean, you know, he could travel without any difficulty from Italy right up to England, and
Indeed.
He dressed Parliament a couple of times in England as well, you know, on Henry III's behalf. So, you know, even relatively quite early on when he arrived, actually. So, you know, like Simon de Montfort, he could speak whatever language was required.
There's a lot. I did actually show a letter of Edward's to a scholar here, and they said this was Edward I, and they said, "My goodness me, what a melange! It's standard French, it's Occitan, it's Arpitan, it's actually Latin. It's got everything in there, almost mixed in together." But this language thing is interesting because Arpitan is relatively close to Occitan, and it's also relatively close to Provençal. So you have these various languages that are existing in the southern part of what's now France in the 13th century. One of the advantages of the Savoy alliance is that Peter, William before him, they speak the language of all the other people that Henry and others want to get into this alliance. So it's actually who you would get into an alliance, because yes, Peter's an international chap. Guillaume was also the same. They're going to speak Parisian French. They're going to speak English. They're going to speak Norman French and so forth. But they can speak the local dialects all around this region, going down to Provence and round to Bordeaux. That is going to be crucial to get an alliance together.
Wasn't there like seven dialects of Occitan or something like that?
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, because I remember David Carpenter getting in touch with me about somebody called William Boncoeur, who was a name which, you know, you never come across. He happens to have a role in the Mise of Amiens in 1264, and Matthew Paris says he was very useful because he spoke Spanish or Castilian, I suppose, and he was sort of the minder of some Castilian delegation which came to visit Henry. I think it's something along those lines. So I rather think the fact that he remarked that he spoke this language suggests that that was a rather unusual language, whereas some of these as you say, these Francophone languages were perhaps relatively well known amongst the grand aristocracy, although there is an issue, isn't there, something to do with tournaments and people misunderstanding people's senses of humor. And so I think and this causing sort of unpleasantness in tournaments. I can't remember, there's a reference somewhere in Matthew Paris. So I I think sometimes there were problems with some of the dialects. I think
I make the case in my book about the de Montfort family that in all likelihood, I believe that Simon de Montfort and Eleanor Provence would have had an easy time communicating with each other, because Simon grew up around Carcassonne. I mean, he was exposed to an Occitan language his whole youth.
He did. honestly, Darren, this didn't matter. They
Well-
all spoke the same language because they were high aristocrats. And it's a bit like, you know, the aristocracy in Queen Victoria's time.
Right, okay, but
the
when,
grand aristocrats.
all right,
all
but when Eleanor and
communicate with each other.
Sanchia would meet, they would probably speak Occitan and not French. I mean, it's just
Yes, well,
there's-
whatever. It didn't matter really. They
Yeah.
were polylingual, and
But-
it
well,
was
yeah.
part of being an aristocrat.
But
That's
imagine
very
what Henry's French would have sounded like with his mother coming from Poitou and John too. So
And he was
Henry
teased.
spoke several languages.
He was teased a great deal in Paris with his
Yes.
way he spoke French,
yeah.
which is nothing new. If all of us as Anglophones, if you come to France and you speak French, attempt to speak French, the accent that you speak, my goodness me.
Yeah.
So that's not new.
You spoke the local dialect to servants, didn't you, really, basically? And then you had this kind of courtly, some sort of courtly version of French, which was internationally recognizable, which did for wherever you happened to be in the right sort of royal circles.
But what language, the vernacular, what did Peter speak in his everyday speech rather than if he was speaking to Parliament or he's speaking to...
Well, it didn't matter where it depended on where he was, really. I mean, Peter had a number of English advisors, and either they were polylingual or Peter, you know, they must have been able to speak in some common language. I mean, these people were helping Peter run his estates in England, for example. I mean, it's true, he had Giscard de Charon as his grand estate administrator, but, you know, there were other councillors as well. So, you know,
I think all of these French people who came to England had to have picked up a kind of basic working English simply because they were there so long. I mean, we have that one entry in I believe it's the Chronicle in one of the northern ones where it says specifically that Simon de Montfort did not know English when he arrived, which suggests that he picked it up or learned a great deal of it. After all, he was there for 30 years. His children could very well have.
Well, he wasn't there very often
to each other.
He was almost as much an absentee from England as Peter of Savoy was. But yes, I agree
that's
with
true too.
I mean, Montfort was no idiot. You know, he knew
if I can just interject there, one Hugh mentioned Guichard de Charon. We visited Charon. It today is in the Valrome district of Bougé, which is a sort of a coat to on the road from Chambéry up to Bellegarde. It is 3 farms and a house, and that's the total. And let me just say to you, there are moments when you visit somewhere that you have a double take, and you go, "Gosh." You come out of this tiny hamlet is the best word to describe Charon. The road from Charon to Bellegarde, which we were taking home towards Geneva, is the Col de Richemont. And it is the English spelling of Richemont, not the French.
Oh, wonderful.
And nobody there knows where that name comes from.
Yeah, excellent.
Giscard de Charon married an Englishwoman, didn't he? I think.
Yeah, and he was the steward. There were 2 Guichard de Charons, of course.
His son was
they were.
Well.
Yeah, he held Richmond Castle, of course. So where this name Col de Richemont, the Richemont Pass, comes from in the Valrome, nobody knows. But
wonderful.
Isn't it amazing? But it should in French have a T at the end, and it has a D.
See, there you go.
Well.
It does make you wonder. It does make you wonder whether somebody got back to Charon.
Oh, no doubt. You know, I'm sure they were in communication with their aunties or whatever it is back at home. You know, yes.
And John, if I could ask you, in your research, did you find any connection that we don't know of between Peter of Savoy and Peter d'Agen-Blanche, you know, the Bishop of Hereford? Because he was quite an influence at this time, and I suppose he must have come up with the first wave of Savoyards, but I don't know his so much connection.
He was the clerk of Guillaume. he was his clerk and came up at that point.
Yeah, so he was already established before
Yeah,
Peter of Savoy came. Yeah.
He was there. He's basically Guillaume's number 2. So he gets a job, and then I can't remember off the top of my head. Hugh probably knows better than I. The first job that he got at court, and then very soon after he becomes he gets the See of Hereford.
I read some. Yeah, sorry, I read some. Wasn't he? Some people have suggested he might have been a legitimate member of the House of Savoy, but I can't remember exactly.
It's possible. It's very difficult with that part of the world. He's the family de Briançon. Exactly the past of that family, you start to go into that. The problem with Savoy is that most of these records just don't exist. One of the things actually that I find frustrating is that the records here in England, we have almost too many records. We have so much medieval source material. Here, there were so many revolutions and so many political changes. So much was lost. So it's difficult with someone like A. Blanchies to get the family starts to become clouded in history. And this is, of course, even with the Comital family, you go back to Humbert Whitehands, the first Count of Savoy, exactly where that family comes from, again clouded in mystery. The grandsons, exactly the same. Where do they come from originally?
But I wonder what was the relationship between Aigueblanche and Peter of Savoy. I mean, because they were both more or less, might say, equal in Henry's councils, but I wonder if there was a kind of competition between them.
I think they worked hand in glove. Sorry,
I've got to go now. So sorry. But thanks very much, Fred. I really enjoyed it.
The family links, you ask a very good question, Darren, because one thing that I wasn't appreciative of enough writing Peter of Savoy and starting to write Grandson's book is that the grandsons were very closely related to the Comital family too. And so effectively the grandsons and the Chamvons who find preferment at court via Peter, again, it's part of the wider family network. So the answer to your question is no, I didn't, but it wouldn't surprise me.
This is one thing about Henry, you know, he rewarded these fellows for sure, but he made them work for it. I mean, he was always sending them somewhere. And I believe it was Aigueblanche who had to get to Castile as soon as possible for the treaty. And I think he covered that whole distance in like 9 days. It was like some kind of record.
It's amazing. There is a wonderful little thing that comes from the Edward's reign of Otto de Granson, and about 20 years into the reign or so, the boatman at Dover is in some sort of legal trouble. And what survives, he writes a letter to Otto basically saying, please help. So Otto is traveling to and fro between Visson and Dover. So often the boatman knows him.
Yeah.
And you know, that's quite a story. It's a bit like you're a frequent flyer on the plane and the check-in girl knows you.
Maybe Otto even had credit with him.
It makes you wonder. But yeah, the amount of traveling they did,
they must have had stomach walls of steel, because if you look at Henry III, every time Henry ever went across the Channel, you find there are huge donations to various shrines. And in one case, wasn't there something like man-sized candles had to go around? I think it was the shrine of Edward the Confessor, while the king was traveling, was sailing the Channel. You know, these people were some of these people were terrified, probably with good reason, of the Channel crossing. You know, Peter Savoy don't think twice about it.
I called more or less David Carpenter out on his volume 2 of the Henry biography, that it seems to me that he purposely left out the Dunstable annalists writing that Edward, when they had that storm on the way to Amiens, and Edward panicked and he just poured out prayer after prayer for deliverance. And this was Edward and not Henry. You know, we don't know what Henry's doing, but we know Edward is having a meltdown. But, you know, David tries to present Edward as this cool, you know, figure throughout the book. And so I think he purposely leaves that little anecdote out for this. So, yeah.
You mentioned earlier about the Magna Carta.
Yeah, sure.
One thing that you get in Wurstenberger is the statutes of Savoy. So when Peter comes back to Savoy, 1263. He basically introduces the civil service, he introduces the legal system, he introduces everything that he's seen in England. So I often say to people here in the Swiss Romande, you know, when they're filling in forms with the civil service or whatever, look, I'm sorry, you know, it came from England, and I do apologize for that. Because when you read the statutes of Savoy, it almost feels like a cut and paste, some of it from the Magna Carta. And you get this great line, one in particular, my judges will not delay justice, they will give justice as quickly as they possibly can. And you go, oh, goodness gracious, I know where you have that from.
Well, you know, that is true, but I have to think that these principles were just timeless. I mean, you know, the idea of doing justice, you know, this went back, you know, all the way to the beginning of civilization. I mean,
but it was how it was done, Darren. The French system generally was that the local seigneur, he was the law.
Right.
What of course, Henry II had done, it introduced this thing, this common law in England, that it was the king's law, not the Lord's law. And the first thing that Peter does is he introduces a bailli system. So the local lords, of course, are not dispossessed. They carry on in their castle like the grandsons and so forth. But what he has in each region all around Savoy, he has his man in his little tower or whatever, and he's dispensing the count's law. And it's a systematic law across the whole of the county of Savoy, and he gets that from England. He gets this. And one of the things, I was watching something on French TV, and the French still say, well, in all of France, of course, the feudal system, the law was the local seigneur. And you go, well, no, it wasn't, not in this part of France, at least, because this part of France had imported the system from England. So the common law existed here. So it's a good example of how you can't have a national story just applying to all of what's now a national territory.
I think you're absolutely right there. And also, there is some evidence, isn't there, in Peter's statutes that he enabled poor people, or at least in theory, to cut a certain amount of red tape in order to get justice faster. And I think there he was copying the querelle system under the baronial reform movement. And I do, I mean, I take Darren's point, really, that in some ways, I think some of this may have stemmed from a kind of a common piety amongst grand aristocrats. You know, we need to look after the lower orders, and sometimes it may have been lip service, but it's very interesting that Peter copies it anyway. And I think he'd got that sort of mind that he could see the advantages of appearing to be very much a sort of a person who could offer good, fair justice, swift justice to all.
Well, but
although his own estate administration was
do as I say, not as I do.
You know?
But what's really unique is that Peter is looking to England for this idea of justice, and not to his neighbor Louis. You know, Louis, who is volunteering for this.
Some have argued that that Peter's officials were copying French bailli. Have you read that?
Yeah, I saw that, and it is more the English system. But one of the things that's interesting as well with this bailli system is that if you ever get to visit Chambéry, the castle there is what became the ducal castle, because the county became a duchy eventually. There is a very small room. Most of it's not open. It still looks after the commune, but they have the Chambre de Compte, the Chamber of Accounts, and they have on display pipe rolls. And of course, this is the other system that Peter brings from England. He requires that his bailli send him yearly accounts, and they have to account for it. He basically replicates the Shire county system that existed in England. He brings that to Savoy. And now this is fascinating, because the reason we know so much about the career of Master James of St. George and the people who come to eventually build the castles in North Wales is because Peter's already introduced the pipe roll system. So actually,
it comes around, right?
Yeah, we wouldn't know about all these people coming from Savoy to build the castles in Wales unless it was that Peter had introduced his pipe roll system. So yeah, it's law, it's administration, and he does that all within 3 or 4 years.
Right.
It's as soon as he gets his under the table, that's it. Yeah, the English system is going to be ready.
Peter was very interested in micromanagement. I mean, you know, this thing that I've just done on Peter's charters reveals that, and it. I mean, of course, as I say, you know, the reality of his estate administration in England, it might well have been rather less than a sort of a tidy scheme, but and often very, very heavy-handed. But there, I think, again, there is this attention to detail and you know, getting the last halfpenny out of people, I think. So I think Peter was really very, very, very keen on all that. He knew the importance of controlling finances, like, you know, like these great administrative medieval kings like Henry I and so on, and so on. Yeah.
So these bailli are sending his yearly accounts exactly down to the last penny. How much of the count's money have I spent? Yeah.
So this was more or less England influencing continental administration because of this Savoyard, or you know, influence.
One thing that I found, Darren, is that there is a certain reluctance among certain English academics to accept the Savoyard influence in North Wales and the castles that are built there, and to try to find, no, they weren't necessarily Savoyard castles. The English people were doing X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of nativism going on there, but actually you find that the relationship, the influence is in both directions. They're influencing each other, which is what you would expect.
And as you say, this is all natural. It just naturally happens, you know. So
people talk. If somebody has a better way to do it, they go, okay, we'll take that. And one of the things that is an interesting sort of thing about Peter of Savoy as well is that you have this clash in this baronial war between nascent nationalism and Simon de Montfort appealing to a nascent nationalism in England, and so a figure like Peter. And you have to remember that Peter's part of the world didn't come to nationhood ever. Savoy never became a nation, and it only ever became really attached to a nation in the 19th century. So they had in that region almost no idea of nations. So you have this army going up to Flanders, going over to Pevensey, who are going there for one reason only. They're going to serve their lord. Right. The idea of nation doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. And you have Simon de Montfort appealing on the other side to this idea of nation, despite being a Frenchman. So you have this.
And the thing about Simon, it always fascinates me. You know, we all know he was very cool and calculating, and I wonder if, for example, Peter hadn't been in England at that time. You know, how did that figure into his idea of launching this war? You know, or even Boniface. You know, to have this entire Savoyard element, which was more or less in control of Sussex. They were all gone, and Simon knew he needed to secure those ports to have any success against Henry. And those brothers are gone, so he's like, "Hey, let's do it."
I had the pleasure to do a presentation at Pevensey Castle or Pevensey to the people in Pevensey and introduce them to the guys that had defended their castle for over a year. Can you imagine traveling all the way from Savoy up to Flanders, crossing by boat to a castle being held in a hostile country and holding that castle for a year? And I was asking the people here, and I said, what is the trait? Michael, unfortunately, is gone, who's got Vaudois ancestry. But I said, what is the key character trait of this part of the world? And they said, stubborn. So I said to the people, sorry, Hugh, just a moment. I said to the people of Pevensey, you have to understand your castle was held by Yorkshiremen.
John, I just wanted to ask a question. I don't know the answer to this. Did Pevensey fall to the Montfortians?
No,
I thought it did.
What's interesting, sorry, Hugh, about that Pevensey Castle siege is how much Edward learns, because when, of course, he goes to North Wales, all of the castles are capable of resupply by sea.
I see, yes.
And of course, the reason Pevensey doesn't fall, Darren, is that it's getting resupplied every night.
Yeah, sure.
It's on a little peninsula sticking out into the English Channel, and every night there are boats coming in with food and with new soldiers and so forth.
Sure, but imagine if somebody like Edward was laying siege to it and not Simon Jr.
but Edward learns from that, and so it's really no surprise that all of these castles in North Wales, Edward is a learner. One thing I was looking at the moment of doing the, I'm in the middle of the Lord Edward's Crusade and research for that, and when they get to Acre, they decide to have a raid out of Acre in July.
Right. Yeah.
And they're in armor, they're in the full bit, and all of the sources, the Arab sources and the Occidental sources, all say they were suffering from heat stroke and exhaustion. Okay, well, the next time they make a sortie, the next time they go out of the castle is in November.
Right.
So
but here you wonder, because we know, for example, that Simon de Montfort had a very good understanding of history with his insult to Henry about Charles the Simple and all that. But did Edward not know about 1187 and the Battle of Hattin? You know, because it was really the same thing.
Apparently not. They decided to go out for this sortie, and it wasn't well altogether very well done.
Yeah.
But he learned. That's the thing. He seems to have learned. Every time he like at the Battle of Lewes, he goes off charging after the Londoners. The thing, going back to the Peter thing, the bit that also makes me think with Peter and the finances, what an elegant system. Peter has the honor of Richmond. He has all these sheep.
Mm-hmm.
He has the port of Boston in the honor of Richmond, so he has the port that the wool is shipped out from. And his brother Thomas is the Count of Flanders, where all this stuff is going to. Yeah. My goodness me, what a system!
Must have been coining it, I know. Yes. You know, yeah. John, did you ever meet Simon Lloyd in Newcastle? Was he still there when you were there?
No.
All right.
No, but this is the same Simon Lloyd that has written a paper that I was looking at of the people on Lord Edward's Crusade.
That's it. Yes. He used to be. Well, he was a student. He was a graduate student when I was doing my first degree at Oxford, and he. So I sort of slightly knew him anyway. But I surprised. Well, I didn't know what happened to him really. Perhaps he gave up being an academic. I can't remember now. Something like that happened, perhaps. Anyway, never mind. It doesn't matter.
Gentlemen, we're coming to the end. It was great. I actually preferred this way than the slide. I spent some time on that slideshow. I'll use it another time. But anyway, again, I have to show it one more time for everybody. So this is the book. So more or less.
John, I wish your book I wish it every blessing. I hope it's a great success. Who's publishing it?
Pen and Sword.
Yeah, which is
Pen and Sword, right? Oh, splendid! I shall look forward to it.
All right.
Reading it.
Yeah, and I've already read your paper. Of course, you were very kind to send that through to me that really sort of required Pen and Sword to do a number of rewrites, Hugh, which they were throwing their arms up in the air. But thank you very much for doing that.
All right.
Oh, well, my pleasure. Yes.
Gentlemen, it was great.
Bye now. All the best to you. Thank you, Darren, for organising this.
So thank you, Darren.
Nice to meet you, John.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.